This show is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network.
To join our community Discord or see more content from our members, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com.
In today's episode, we discuss transformative immersion, writing and acting, and medium mindsets. This is the DM Shower Thoughts. Welcome back. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to today's episode of the DM Shower Thoughts, the show where we talk about our shower thoughts in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons and other tabletop scenarios and how to become your best self through gaming. My name is Adamus.
I'm John.
And I'm Ian.
And let's kick things right off. I ran 2 games now of kind of, I wouldn't even say restarting campaigns, because one is Grey Owl's Legacy, where we are revisiting other characters we played up to level 20 and are still level 20 and sort of coming back to them. And then I ran session 1, chapter 1 for Grey Owl's campaign 2. And this time around we have 2 groups, and they're in different parts of the world, different stories. And this is in a place called Aesir. It is a warm city of 5 concentric rings that sort of slowly rotate. Very big city. And they're all around this floating temperance thing, like a giant obelisk of radiant warmth, like a living sun. There's a whole religion based around it because they think it's semi-sentient. But it pushes the cold away, and then that's surrounded by frozen tundra. And we had our first session last night, and there were a few things that came up that were really interesting, and came up even at the session 0, and a few characters having a 0.5 where they establish relationships with each other. I've said before that we prefaced this game with an emphasis on relationships and exploration and social interaction, where combat would be, when the combat occurred, it would be probably a little bit intense. It might be that much more important, but also that there are other forms of conflict resolution that instead we'll talk about them as encounters instead of combats. And that is going to change. That little subtle change in language makes a huge adjustment to how we resolve this conflict. Instead of just rushing in guns blazing because we really want to fight, we don't know why this creature is there. Maybe it's worth at least having a conversation. If it turns to conflict, we'll defend ourselves. And also, how much more valuable is it if there's maybe another way? Maybe this is a possible ally. And it's kind of upgrading our play so that we begin to consider those things. In building that with everyone, I gave everybody a separate document, as well as a shared document of the world. And then as each of us as players interact with things, I add things to their individual documents of what you know from this. And then the big one, so that people can kind of keep track of everybody's names and whatnot. People were vigorously writing things down, which is a lot of fun. And this is a group that I use the chat with them to put out physical descriptions and put out things that I want to make sure they don't miss. And they do such a good job listening to each other, and they want to hear the audio of each other. It's like they're watching a movie in that way. And so there's a lot of acting that gets put into that. For me, that's very energizing. And for them, that's very energizing. They want to act things out. They still might type it, and that's good. And we're starting to get there as a group. But this is a group that, I won't say they're resistant to the chat, but they use the chat to make jokes. That's where they interact with each other and make jokes and have silly time with that. And that's where they can, make their commentary without interrupting the scene that's playing out in that way. So it's really nice to have the chat for that way, which is also different than every other game I use the chat in. But anyway, what all this leads to is a curious moment in role-playing certain setups. And what this also brought up was I had to ask myself 2 questions, really. This is a living, breathing city. So what sort of people does a world of magic and adventuring produce? And then what sort of family units does this world produce? And that one especially is important. But when you get into relationships and that social interaction, especially exploration and your place in a city, each of my PCs in this time around has a job. They have responsibilities, or I've got one character who is a 17-year-old girl, just turned 17 and is in school. There's an academy that she's attending, trying to get to an apprenticeship so she can be free from that. And there are other apprentices, other students in that space. So when she's interacting there are different people that they're working it with, and all those kids have their own flaws and issues and whatnot. We had actual like high school drama in the middle of this D&D game. We had Mean Girls in a D&D game, and it was such a wonderful, hilarious, and really interesting and dynamic experience with that. But if you have an academy, instead of just saying, I go to Wizarding Academy and I study for 4 years and now I'm out. What if you're in year 3 and we actually like move through a little bit, we generalize a lot. We move through a little bit of your academy time. What do your classes look like? Are there certain teachers that you really gravitate toward? What are those teachers like? And then what is the relationship between you and that teacher? And is there a strong rapport there? Do you see them later? Do you know the backstory of that teacher because you've known them for so long? And all these questions started to flow through our personal narratives as we move through each other's days. And then when I go to what sort of family units does this world produce, the old meme of this, the old trope of D&D is that all my parents are dead and now I'm an adventurer. And I even saw circulating recently another a person that had put out, my stable home life doesn't really lend itself to adventuring. Why would I want to leave? And like, I don't know, I've been a rebellious teenager. Like I want to get out. I want to go do things. Like there are reasons for you to leave. And there are other inciting incidents that don't have to involve your family as leverage to go adventuring. We had, because we were starting at hour 1, the days in the world now are 30 hours long. So they talk to them in sets of like hour 1 and then the 7th hour and the 13th hour. And there are certain numbers where there are like breaks in the day, and it's 10 hours of daylight, 20 hours of night right now, which changes things about like when things are open and what you can see in the city and how the city changes when the sun goes down. But we're starting at hour 1, which is dawn. So everybody's getting up, and we started with like the first 7 hours of each of the pairs of groups in their day, and then started the next chunk of time, and they actually have been starting to weave together. But by doing that, we had people like wake up in the morning, and this is what you see in the morning, and these are the people who are near you in the morning, and this is how they interact with you. We had a character wake up, and his roommate like jumped on him and was like, "Where were you last night?" And it created a cool context of who wakes you up in the barracks, who pulls you aside and goes, "Hey, look out there, what's going on with that?" and kind of pushes you into your shift. And then we have 2, one that's of course a teenager, so they wake up in their home, and as they come down, you notice that your father, and then I describe the father, is putting together his lunch. He's probably running a little bit late, and then there's an interaction where you're like, "Why are you running late?" "Hey, let's push you out the door." Oh boy, it was so warm and cool to kind of put myself into the parent, a living parent who has a job. Like, this is a parent who is a machinist. They're a Mac, which is the basic auto mechanic basically for the city. So of course he's going to go do work. And then the mother is upstairs doing fencing, and she is a weaver. She sews metal threads, which has a use and a job in the city. So she has work. And so you have both parents alive, both parents working, and both having a set use in the city, and things to aspire to, and dreams that they want to, and things they want to give to the to their child and want to provide for their child. Or maybe the relationship is rocky and there's really other complexities there. It's not just I am a loving parent. There might be more layers there. They're a character too. But it was interesting to bring about, like, we had that interaction, and then several players like leaned in and typed in the chat and said out loud, just, wait, you have two parents? You have two living, working, breathing parents that seem like nice people? Like, there are certain players who opted in to having more narrative control to how their day works. And then there are other players that went, I want you to describe it. Like, okay. So, and this was a difference in how, I think back to how Grey Owl's campaign 1 began. And it's just, this is night and day. This is completely different logistically. It's completely different approach and preparation. There's so much that I did front load for each individual character, because I knew from, I always call them failings, I learned from the lessons of campaign 1 that how powerful is it if we have each player be an expert in whatever they're doing. And in so doing that, in terms of starting their day, I had some players I just asked, hey, what do you do with, how does the morning look? And then they would describe it. And these are the people that they have. But also some of them are nervous about who do I really know and how do those relationships really work. So I like having this opening session, because by the end of it, we are all of us more comfortable with allowing that player control. Like, how would you interact with that? What is your relationship with these people? And how do you view them now that you see them again? This is also a really curious thing, because when it comes to relationships, two firsts, I guess, for me is role playing several parents, and not just their relationships to the player, the PC, but their relationships to each other. And what is that? What is that? And is this a loving relationship? Is this an understanding relationship? And every relationship has its own complexities. But in actually role playing that and having notes down of, this is how this person behaves, this is how this person speaks, this is the type of language that they use, this is what they look like, this is their job, this character is retired, this one is not, and where do they live, and what does it look like, and what sort of relationship is it if the player character randomly shows up and they go, oh, is it a happy thing, or is it a sad thing, or is it a difficult, challenging thing? And to make those, it also just opens the door of, from a world building perspective, trying to figure out how do families work in this city, inside this structure, especially if there's a school, because you'll have students that are studying to become tailors, and studying to become engineers, and studying to become ringers, which are the rock stars, like roller derby knights in the sport that's played at the city. And then those kids will have parents that may or may not have certain influences to those ends, or maybe they rebel, or maybe it's there's a lot more complexity there, instead of just, we're all orphans and we all go to an adventuring school. It's, you have family structures now and family pressure in some way. And that has a societal implication as well, because it's an intricate, mostly, self-sufficient city. They do have imports and exports, and they're trying to make more connections, but everybody in the city needs to do a thing in order for the city to work. So everybody has a job, and the idea of everyone having a job is a mainstay of the city. So you're always studying to do something. That also sets up the last thing, and then I want to let Ian go, is by the starting places of the players are in a structured society. This is what we spent and we were really energized from our session 0, that everybody has, to some degree, I wouldn't say a job, but they have a place currently in society. They might be fighting to get out of that place, but it's established where they are. So we have a stringer who's the town, not a town guard, but the city gate guard. We have a loader who picks things up and puts them down and makes sure heavy objects are moved properly, but he wants to become a ring knight. We have a girl who's just become old enough to compete in the lesser leagues of the ring knights and wants to become a ring knight of her own. So they connect. And we've got an apothecary specialist who's like an herbalist that just wants to, he's all about knowledge and he wants to become more knowledgeable, and who knows what that's going to manifest in, but we'll see as more opportunities arise. And we have a wayward nomadic type person that isn't connected to anyone, but is kind of in danger. So we need to be careful there. And then we have probably the scariest mamma jamma in the entire city in terms of reputation that is running from that reputation. And it's everybody has established like wages, ways of getting resources, ways of getting food and lodging and whatnot, but they're all different and we all started in different places. And this was a different thing for me because I didn't want to push everybody into like starting positions. I didn't want anything to feel forced. And by doing that, it allowed space and trust to manifest in the players, at least from what I observed, for them to just exist in the world. They don't have to feel like they're rushing anywhere. It's just, oh, it's the 13th hour. I should go to my training practice. Hey, Tarka, you want to come with me? And then you have another character with you. And you know what? Bring your strange wolf buddy. He should come too. And now you have another character with you. So organically, it makes sense. And they're not, the players aren't forcing each other together. They're going, it would make sense for me to call them over. So now you have 3 characters together, and I didn't force them into it. By the end of the session, we have a possible encounter. And then we have an encounter. And we'll see how we deal with it. But we have 4 characters together, and 2 that are in different places nearby, but don't have a reason to jump into this. And that is perfectly okay, because all the players ended the night energized with what they were presented with. All the players were well established in what they're doing and where they want to go, at least for now. And we ended the night ready to play more. It doesn't matter if they were all together as a team by the end, because at the moment for this group, that's not the important thing. They want to live in this world and explore it and kind of find their goals and their dreams. There are conflicts that are going to kind of splash through, but I'm not going to, I don't think I've ever forced them into a spot, but I don't want to feel that pressure of trying to like, there's an enemy there, you should go fight them. It's, this is what you see. What do you do with it? And that's a much more energizing way to play and to run a game. So even though I was doing a lot of role playing, I didn't end the night drained out of my mind. I had a lot of fun. And I know that the players did as well.
So you're speaking to something that I find rather interesting that I've seen at a couple of different tables. Not at tables that I've played at, but at tables that I've seen through other media, which is starting at level 0. And this is, for me, in this scenario, it's just kind of an expression. You're not actually starting at level 0. I'm pretty sure everybody's like level 3 or something in this campaign. But level 0 is kind of the jump start to the whole campaign. It's the origin story. It's the inciting incident for why the characters become adventurers in the first place. I think it's really interesting because you're integrating the premise of your backstory without diving into super specific things, and you're allowing yourself to build that backstory at session 1, as opposed to having to write it out like I do from session 0 or something like that. So I usually come to the table with a backstory prepared that's maybe a couple pages long, but that's just because I like writing fiction and I think it's cool. But I've seen in D&D Beyond articles, actually, that many people are looking at the front story and what that means. The front story is like you have an idea about your character, but you don't really need anything concrete to get the game started. And so when you play the game, it becomes much more rewarding because you explore that front story and it becomes the origin story of your character, which is different from the backstory. The backstory has already happened, more or less. So in this campaign, it's like, oh, my character is a guard. So let's explore the origins of what my character would be like as a guard. What do they do on their shift? And what do they see on their shift? Is there an inciting incident, or do they go normal? And I think that's pretty neat. I think that's a really cool way to give players agency in how their character is situated in the world around them, as opposed to trying to integrate the backstory of the character into a pre-made world. Not either of the, it's an interesting difference, especially in this campaign where social interaction is the priority, whereas so many other campaigns that I've played, I try to strike a balance between combat, social interaction, and exploration. But that's just because I kind of get bored if I do one thing too much. So like in Grey Owl's Legacy, I was doing a lot of really cool social interaction stuff and role playing with Rowan, my level 20 character. But after a while, it was like, all right, I'm done with that part, because it's like it's time to move on. You know, it's not we're not in a soap opera. So we don't need to keep saying, oh, but then the brother shows up with his evil twin, and it's like, okay, now we have to talk to those guys, I guess, or whatever. And if you're into that, that's fine. But like for me, D&D is like I still want to be on an adventure, and an adventure to me is defined as like going out and exploring the world out from the central hub that I am already at, and that's just my play style. But I'm really glad to hear that you are finding energizing experiences in this other play style, which is mostly social interaction, and it speaks to the appeal of political intrigue, cloak and dagger campaigns, and things like that. Isn't there a different one that has to do with courts? I think there's one. I don't know, but yeah, so like I think it's really cool how that's working out. And you asked the question, what kind of people does a world full of magic and adventure make? And I just want to put my 2 cents in, which is that I think that the people aren't really any different from the people in our world. And the reason for that is that let's speak for humans, I guess, specifically, because I don't know any elves, you know, so, but if we speak to humans specifically, people normalize their lives once things become stable and predictable. So even people, let's just take some extremes, people who live in Siberia where the cold gets below like 10 degrees Fahrenheit or something like that, every day, even during the daytime, or people who live in Hawaii on active volcanoes. We've seen what happens when those volcanoes blow up, and we've seen what happens to the society when, the magma is flowing and everything. But during normal times when nothing's going on with those volcanoes, they're just doing their normal stuff. So they might be living around the volcano, like making it a central thing that they build their life around. But in general, people look for normalcy. They look for predictability in their lives. And I think that's pretty interesting when you apply that to fantasy, because it means that even in a world of adventure and magic, stable families can exist. and you just build your life around the ability to use magic, or the ability to go out on an adventure and hunt down a monster or something like that that's been hurting your town, because you want to restore that normalcy, or, anything like that. That's why academies exist. That's why we imagine that guilds exist, because guilds, academies, and all those things are ways to rationalize and normalize a world that is generally chaotic. I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah. To go off of what you're saying, Ian, we've talked about this group, this campaign, both kind of on the podcast and off in a few different ways. And there's a lot of value to this kind of approach. But the reason there's a lot of value, and this is where it's going to start, this is going to be potentially controversial, and I'd love to hear what everyone's reactions to this are, is that what it's doing is establishing a metagame structure that is clearly metagaming in order to create a more compelling narrative. And I think I've had a lot of conversations where, there's this idea that's both printed in the official source materials of the player's handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide. And I've talked with players about this, that authentic narrative D&D play is at odds with metagaming. And I am of the opposite opinion, and my experience tells me the opposite, which is the best narrative D&D games aren't the ones where we hide a metagame structure, it's where we lean into it. So one of the things Adam has been saying a lot is that the group that he just ran, this was a session 0.5. And my inquiry is, what makes this 0.5 versus a session 1? And ultimately, it doesn't really matter. But when you call it a 0.5 for the players, because again, this is creating a specific kind of experience for this group, there is a different level of there's a different kind of expectation based on the shift in language that allows them to metagame in a different way. So for these players, what I'm surmising or inferring is that by calling it a session 0.5, they aren't expecting a central conflict, that they can actually approach it in a relaxed way where they don't even have the expectation that there's anything that's really going to happen. And really what this allows for is a slice of life. And the other thing that a slice of life lets you do is, from a metagaming standpoint, it allows the players to empathize with everybody else's characters in a way that you really can if you start things in the middle of things. So, they talk about this in classical literature, how a lot of epics, like epic poems, start in the middle of things. Like the Odyssey is a really good example of this, where the Trojan War is already over. Odysseus is hanging out in a cave, doing lewd things with a demigoddess. Like, you're not starting when he was a kid and learn something from his dad and his mom, right? And like learned how to be a tactician and then fought in the war and then after the war. In a lot of ways, Star Wars is the same thing, where we pick up, George Lucas has said that the original 6 episodes were really the tragedy of Darth Vader. Darth Vader was the central character of that epic story, and we start in the middle of his journey to redemption, right? Luke Skywalker isn't actually the hero, it's Darth Vader. But if we look at Luke Skywalker as the hero, we start with him as just a moisture farmer who wants to go to Toshi Station to pick up some power converters. Like, we start seeing Luke in kind of a mundane light, and we watch his ascent to herohood to the point that, by the time we get around to like episode 7, if we count that, or we get to like The Mandalorian, people speak about Luke Skywalker in hushed tones. And the Empire sees him basically as like a domestic terrorist, because this one guy with a laser sword took out an AT-AT all by himself just by like hopping in and tossing in a thermal detonator. Like, so there's this idea that what this group values, and I've played with them, and from hearing your like kind of reflective report on how the session went, what I'm gathering is that this group, it's easier to empathize with everyone else's characters when you can see their story play out as a player. When they don't have that, it makes it so much harder for them to be open and vulnerable with their character to other characters. Like with Grey Owl's campaign 1, it was the opposite. We started in the middle of things and nobody trusted anybody. No matter what their behavior was. It wasn't until they got backstory details or got a peek behind the curtain that they really like understood where everybody else was coming from, you know? And we've talked about that on the podcast too, how like revolutionary chapter 12 was for everyone. Because they're like, Solomon's a jerk. And then they found out why. And they're like, oh, well, I guess that makes sense. So for them to be able to start from that meta game empathy, you know, to watch how what everybody else's home life is like, that's going to influence their role play as a character because they got to see it as a player. And really that's what they value. To me, I like my personal preference, because a lot of times when we talk about stuff like this, one of the things that comes out is personal preference, which is no judgment on anybody else's personal preference. I tend to favor kind of starting in the middle of things a little bit and gradually revealing more and more backstory over time. Not necessarily deep, dark secrets, but just kind of understanding where everybody else is coming from. Like Ian and I, we had played in a game last night, and nobody had a backstory. It was just really generic characters. And one of the most exciting things was getting to see the organic development of a team, because we had designed our characters to be a team. So mechanically we were a team, which freed, and we understood what everyone else's mechanics were. So that freed us up to role play. Literally by metagaming, we told a deeper story because we were able to get the mechanics out of the way. We could trust that everybody else was mechanically competent, that now the gameplay was mostly based off the narrative. So, and I just think it's a really interesting thing that I really do feel that the best games I've been a part of aren't the ones where we spend time trying to stamp out metagaming. It's the ones where we acknowledge it and wield it as a usable structure to promote deeper and more engaging play. So that's my soapbox. I'll step off of it.
I don't think that was controversial at all, based on the discussions that we have had anyway. And I have to think about this in a broader umbrella. The broader question has to do with context and agency. And if your agency is better served, and I think this is instant to instant, moment to moment, table to table, it can change. Now, the more times that I have revealed the game state and revealed the gameplay, like literally stepped out and said, flavor aside, this is what's happening. This is what I mean by this. This is the role I'm going to have you do, and this is why. It has been jarring the first few times I've employed it with certain groups because they're not used to me doing that. But it's also been so much more freeing after that. And it has to do with if the players understand how their world works, how their roles are, how their abilities work within the context of the situation, it is exponentially more freeing for them to roleplay. Because now they are not impeded or conflicted by the gameplay. The gameplay now makes sense to them. It isn't a surprise that I rolled this and it was this weird outcome and I did. That's not what I wanted. That's not what I intended. It's, this is why. And I don't ever want this particular group to get like a bad rap in this, because they're actually not as strict about the concept of metagaming. I think that's also because we've had so many more discussions about that. There's always metagaming. It's when we take the knowledge that we already had or the knowledge we procured as players but not characters, and then act on it. And we had many moments being audience members for each other's stories as we went through the little pockets of various areas of people's spaces. And I think you're absolutely right, John, that they empathize as players in a way that they as characters never would have been able to do if we just hit the ground running and had an inciting conflict. But by
just
seeing
to interrupt you for a
Go ahead.
second,
Yeah.
the primary example I meant to point out was we had talked on the podcast about Reb the Cleric, and how when people understood who Reb the Cleric was, they suddenly started forgiving him for healing all the bad guys. So, and we just talked about when the players relaxed when their characters learned that.
Yes. And that ties back into context and agency. The main takeaway in campaign 1 is that I did not take my time before introducing an inciting conflict, before even introducing a momentous storytelling thing. I didn't allow time for the players to just be. And in so doing that, it created a curious character dynamic of no one trusts anyone, and we're all just kind of running. And it also had the negative effect later in the game of people misunderstanding how the world worked, but misunderstanding how the world worked for many sessions. So they themselves misunderstood the framework that they were existing in, which made all of their other decisions go, oh, I shouldn't have done that because that's not how this works. Oops. And whereas now when I refer to this like and it's not really the most accurate term, as like a session 0.5, 0.7, what it is allowing us time to exist in this space, to try out, also almost from a place of safety. So if you're a character and you're a student, I go to my classes, I have these interactions in the halls, I have people that interact with me in certain ways, and I can experiment interacting with them and thinking about how I would interact with them. I see how that goes. But my decision isn't like, now the school blows up and I don't get to do anything with that person anymore. It's like, this is a slice of life thing. And by establishing that, it also starts to establish what kind of relationship you want to have with these different characters that are navigating around you, what's valuable to you. And the way I've framed this, at least the first 3 chapters, are your first 3 days. And that's huge because it will establish routines. And then if something breaks that routine, it'll also feel that much more satisfying. Whereas if you don't know what the status quo is, how will you understand or be allowed to flow through the status quo being upset? If you don't know, and that was the other problem with Grey Owls, I try to establish things, but then we hit the ground in the middle of the action and everything exploded. So all the structures that should have been in place were like feeling the Vertigo cast and feeling their presence, or feeling the presence of the Grinning Brand and feeling the presence of the various towers and the courts, didn't actually matter because we didn't have time to feel that. We didn't have time to experience it. And we didn't really have time to experience the idea that if you use magic, you can be arrested, because we went into a space where that was suddenly safe, even though it wasn't, but it was. And it created a different tone that was a cognitive dissonance to the established rules after session 1, and then it all changed. And that is the thing I don't want to happen with this. We've put in so much time and energy and effort from myself and the players to establish at least their starting places in this city. And we have established in session 0 that the city is sort of your central hub, and you will explore beyond the city, but the idea being that you've established a home here. Maybe you want to leave that home later, but for now, it's your home, so you might return to it. And it's creating that central hub. And by doing that, they're all exploring the hub. And that's really cool. Plus, I can establish all these businesses and whatnot, but now we have this other thing we've spoken about briefly, which is the players adding flavor to the world. And now the world becomes that much more personal to them because they have, it's not just me telling them the story, they are a part of it.
That's something that I've been learning from the other podcast show on Darkmoor Podcast Network, Advantage, where the DM Joe, they have created this whole unique world inspired from Faerunian lore, but the world is flat too, which is pretty cool. That's a new thing that I haven't seen. And they have their players talk about the world as if they live there and as if they could come up with something that they would see in that world. So there's a scene in the podcast where the players are on a little bit of a journey in a flying ship thing, and they are passing by a tall tower of ice, basically. Joe has the players say, what do you know about this? What do you know about this place, basically? What do you see right now as we're passing by? And the players fill in that information. And that is a type of world building. Sorry, I'm getting sun in my eyes. That is a type of world building that I feel is yet to be explored thoroughly in gameplay, traditionally in D&D. Because the DM is usually the person with all the descriptions and all the facts, the hard facts about the world. And it leaves less room for the players to interact with it when you treat it like that. To speak to what John was saying about metagaming, how many characters experience something kind of one-on-one with the DM and have the other players forget that they are not there? Their characters are not watching this happen. It's a one-on-one thing. It's what the whisper function is for on Roll20, really. Because then the other characters just don't know, and you don't have to worry about it. But in terms of metagaming, there's something that a lot of groups do, which is you just hand wave it by saying, my character exposits what the DM just said, because it'd be too long to just go and roleplay it out and describe it again, because we already described it once and everybody heard it. So I don't think there's too much wrong with metagaming in the sense of trying to create a better narrative, like John says. I think the only thing that I have a problem with when it comes to metagaming is stuff like looking up monster stats for the encounter you're in. Like, don't do that. That's kind of lame. Or looking up the module, even worse. There was a community episode, which is banned, by the way, that the gang is like playing D&D with each other. I won't say why it's banned, but the gang is playing D&D with each other. And Pierce, the old man, is excluded from the group in this sense, and then comes in later and happens to have access to the module that they're playing. And he's like, I want to be part of this. And, of course, that leads to some dark shenanigans. But it's quite, yeah, I know, right? It's quite interesting because that's hardcore metagaming. That's like metagaming that ruins the game. I think that might be the defining line, actually, is when metagaming starts to make things bad in the game, make things worse, ruin the experience, ruin the immersion for players. That's when metagaming becomes a problem, because you're just basically just ruining the suspension of disbelief for everyone else when you do the kind of metagaming I'm talking about. But when you do metagaming in a way that is conducive to the narrative and makes things easier to understand and immerse ourselves in, that's when it's like, yeah, that's fine. Like, whatever. Like hitting a monster's AC, for example. AC is not a thing in the world. It's a gameplay mechanic. But after a while in combat, you're going to hit that AC. And is it metagaming then to say, or to have a character know what they need to hit it now? Maybe if they've exposed a weakness narratively. Is it metagaming to have players tell each other what the AC is? It's like, oh, okay, now I know what I need to hit. No, it just takes a load off people's shoulders. And I think that's fine.
I think that there's also not a middle ground, like not a compromise, but there's a win-win here, which is, so for those of you who haven't checked it out yet, we now have a website, dmshowerthoughts.com, which can post all sorts of blog posts, and all of our podcast episodes are up on it, as well as the thing I'm going to talk about, which is the recap fiction. So, which is, you know, a lot of times in my we've talked about this a little bit in my latest campaign world, because I have my players record their gameplay decisions with a chat. Basically, we get to play the game twice. We get to play the game once in its spontaneous creation using game rules and using metagame thinking. Not, again, as a positive thing, not as something that's going to undercut the narrative experience. But basically, once we've had the fun of spontaneously creating something together, I go back and I retell it as a short story. And the reason I call it a retelling is there might be lines that I edit that like a player said, but they didn't really want to say after the fact. There might be things I retcon, things I edit to make a functional story. And really the fun part of that is now the players can go back and see how their decisions, what decisions ended up making it in the final cut, what decisions, mostly for the players, got thankfully removed because it might have been inappropriate or they misheard something or misinterpreted something. And the players get to really relive their adventure without any of the game structure. It's purely narrative on the second way through. And now they all are able to take on the accountability for themselves of immersing themselves in the game world. So they don't need to experience the slice of life stuff because they've experienced the canon again, you know? And because of that, like, that's why I think that the metagame conversation is interesting. How much do we value gameplay, as in the spontaneous act of playing out the game, versus how much we respect the narrative, which is what we agree on is the official story that we're telling. And this was kind of an additive practice, but it's a really good example of one way that you could do it. Again, not judging or discounting anybody else's methods. This has been the method that I've found the most exciting from however long we've been doing this.
It is interesting to note, this is another moment where we started a campaign in the context of Roll20. And whereas this group started a campaign, the previous campaign, in person. And that has a certain flow to it. And then we changed to online, and that had its own bumps. And now we are restarting with this, the framework of a structured space where we didn't like just have a brunch and build. We had a month or two of feeding information to each other, of checking on things, of asking questions, of having a whole bunch of interplay there to establish this space. And even in so doing that, the spontaneous role play is extremely energizing. With this group in particular, and they want to act. There's a physical acting that comes from it, which is why I got into the habit of recording them, of like just putting on a microphone in the background so that they can feel free to act, and that has value, great, tremendous value to them. And then, but I didn't want to forget that story. So that's where my tradition of sifting through hours of audio and then trying to transcribe that story, because we found that spontaneous story so valuable. And now the struggle, I can already feel it, is I find that story extremely energizing with this group of people. There's a good energy there that connects differently. It hits different than other tables. And many other tables, there's a uniqueness, like capturing lightning in a bottle, to this particular group. What can also be a challenge there, and I want to frame it as a challenge, is remembering what was said, remembering what was done, and putting it into the framework of is it enough to enjoy the experience in the spontaneity of it, and then when we revisit it, like in a recap sort of scenario, that it is more generalized. Is that all right? Does the specificity of what we said in the moment have to be preserved if we just wanted to act it out? And in acting it out in that spontaneity, in that moment, was fulfilling enough? Do we have to transcribe it later to relive it? And there's a part of me that says yes, because I found great value and I'd love to revisit it. And there's another part of me that says that's really hard to do given the current framework, unless I record it and then sift through the audio, which we've already discussed on this podcast is exhausting. Rewarding too, because I get to kind of relive it, but also exhausting. And maybe the context isn't writing. Maybe it is. I give the recordings to the players so they can re-listen to it in the background, kind of like a podcast, and they can hear what transpired anyway. It's just how would I then deliver if we really love that spontaneous role play? How do I then re-deliver that experience? Because I want them to relive it. I want them to kind of build that momentum again before we play again. And that's really, really fun. That we've done that before in the past, and it's been highly effective in getting us to re-immerse. My challenge now, because it was so enjoyable last night, I had to vigorously write down everything that we did. I don't know if in a month the players are going to remember all the momentum they had built up, and how do we revisit that in a clean, efficient way that is also enjoyable and energizing.
Well, and before we move on from this topic, the one thing that I want to kind of bring up, because, you know, I love when we have a functional tool that we can point to. The Dungeon Master's Guide, right at the beginning, has a section called Know Your Players. And there is a reason why the actor player type is different from the storyteller player type. They aren't one and the same. And I think a lot of times players there's some overlap there, but they really kind of almost see them as the same thing. So acting players love the opportunity to develop their characters' personalities and backgrounds, interact regularly with NPCs, and incorporate elements from their characters' backstories into their adventures. They love, like you said, Adam, the physicality of acting and voicing things, whereas storytellers are more interested in contributing to a narrative, right? And really, I think that's the key difference between the two teams that ended up splitting from Gray Owls, right? It wasn't that you had one that was more social interaction and one that was more combat. You had a team that liked acting and a team that liked storytelling, right? Not that the acting players didn't like storytelling, but their priority was in acting versus storytelling, right? And storytelling, same thing. They use their characters' backgrounds to help shape the stories of the campaign. That's different than giving opportunities to develop their character's personality and background, right? So for acting, it's more about their character and really getting to show off their character, whereas storytelling is, how does my character relate to the Dungeon Master's story and the narrative that they set up, you know? And again, neither of these are wrong approaches, but there's a whole section here in the DMG about it. And with storytellers, they love making an encounter that advances the story in some way. Acting players don't, that if they prioritize acting, like you were saying, it's not about a momentous story you're trying to push. But if you tried to play that style with our team, the team Legacy, we would go bonkers, because we want an objective. We just want you to tell us what our mission is. We'll find a reason. We'll write a reason why our character is hooked into the story. But when we go through an encounter, if it's not advancing the story, it's inefficient. You know, it's not telling anything, you know? It's also making storytellers like making their characters' actions steer future events, right? So, and that's where the player agency comes from. for an acting player, based on this definition, right? For an acting player, their choices are meaningful in that they develop their character. Storytellers want to see their decisions affect the world, right? Or affect the setting, you know? And the last thing is the storytellers look for NPCs that have ideals, bonds, and flaws that it says here that the adventurers can exploit. I would say leverage, because exploit means you're taking advantage of them. I would say leverage in that you are using them kind of synergistically to create a better story, right? And I think I mentioned the Office Ladies podcast earlier. The Office is one of my favorite shows from a production standpoint, from a philosophical standpoint, how they decided to go about creating something very unique that stands the test of time. I mean, Peacock, if you try to like get a membership, your memberships are based off of how much of The Office you want to watch. It'll say, do you want to watch all of The Office? Pay $4.99. They know it's the only thing that matters. But the idea is that, you know, one of the things that Greg Daniels, who was the creator, really believed was that the writers should understand what it's like to act. But those are two fundamentally different roles between writing and acting, right? And I think for our group, and I noticed this with last night's group too, we're all really more writers than we are actors. That doesn't mean we're not interested in storytelling, but it does mean that the kind of storytelling and how we approach the gameplay is going to look fundamentally different to players that are interested in storytelling versus players that are interested in acting, you know? And it's just something to kind of note that they are two different things, and you can do both. But really, it might not be a bad question to ask the group, you know, are you interested in a record? Are you interested in storytelling? Or is this enough, you know? Because sometimes when you ask the question, you get really interesting answers, you know?
Yeah, that's huge too. And this actually ties directly into trying to bring a little bit of this full circle. This group, and with Legacy too, I think you two that were in Legacy, you can remind me if I'm misremembering, but we pre-framed before even the session began. I said this is what I expect this to be. And with last night's example, I said we're going to take our time. We're going to do this in pairs, and you're starting at hour 1 in the day. You're going to move through segments of the day and kind of your daily life moments, and that might reveal things that you see, and it's going to have interactions. And but I'm going to give you opportunities to explore in your day, and so be prepared with what your wake up cycle is, what you're wearing, like physical description, and have an idea, because I've already given them documentation of these are the things in your day. Have an idea of what you're going to do, and then it'll go organically from there. And I think I was also keen to remind myself to take my time. So I said it 3 times during the evening of, how's everyone doing? Remember, we're taking our time. But they were taking their time. I just needed to, and I think for the third one, I said, this is really for me. I need to remind myself to slow down and let ourselves explore. And in so doing that, it was so, so powerful. But this group feels, and when we talk about the actor type and the narrative type, you'll have a mixture at the table, and I do think it does fluctuate. But I find what is most energizing to this group is acting. And if we think about it, like they're more like 60-40 or 70-30 actor to narrative at any given point. Because they want to see things sort of written down, and they're always recording. They're always writing things down. They're like huge note takers, but they connect with the audio. They want to hear it and see it. And they want to then contribute to that audio, like a radio play in a lot of ways. And that's what they find the most engaging and immersive. Whereas with Team Legacy, it seems like, there's acting involved still, but the acting is often written. And it's like it's given space for us to act in that way. And then I wonder if it's actually, instead of like 20/80 acting versus narrative, it's really 100% narrative. It just manifests in writing. And if there's a vocal expression, it's really just me. And it's because I want to do a voice, but then I'll also write it down. Because to me, acting is very engaging. But that way you can all get what you want, and I can still get what I want. And that's a good table. now we're okay. The DM's happy. And the DM can play because my version of play involves acting. But I'm not going to force my players into acting if what they find the most engaging is writing out.
Yeah, actually, that's pretty interesting because I also do something similar at my tables where I have pre-generated descriptions, mostly because I like having them. I don't know. There's something about that radio play-esque, like, you've already written it out. It's not really improv. I don't want to improv describing crucial scenes or even just setting the stage. I want those nice, clean, concise. I say concise. They're like a paragraph, but that's just because I talk. But there's something about it that it's like writing a book, but there's also, I try not to actually write a book because D&D isn't writing a fantasy novel. It's like on WebDM, they were talking the other day about how you as the DM you're not a writer of a fantasy novel. You're a guide through this world, and you have some descriptions of this world, but you're not like trying to constrict the world by turning it into a novel, even though I have novel elements. And so I think there's something there that you were talking about where you want to preserve the memory kind of the sessions that you've experienced, especially the ones that feel the most energizing, the ones that are really that lightning in a bottle, those wonderful scenes where every player is synergizing with each other and it's very dynamic and it makes sense. That's even better when it makes sense. And I that's when I consider personally whether or not I want to write story notes for the next session. And you can see this on my Discord where I have story notes for each of the campaigns I do. Or if I want to do a short fiction, if I want to take a scene, expand upon it, really get into the perspectives of each character in the scene and what they're thinking, what they're feeling, what they see in general. Because I think those are really what does the session justice, as opposed to, like you said, recording a whole session of 6 hours even, and sifting through that and trying to find something. Just jotting down those little notes like you're doing, jotting down those little notes of like, this is what happened, and this was like how these two characters interacted. Like, was it antagonistic? Was it not antagonistic? I don't know if I can call it protagonistic. Like, I don't know if that's I don't think that's a real definition or a real adjective rather, of how I want to use it. But that's what those notes are for, is creating a short fiction personally. But I can also use those notes for just story notes, just saying, hey, last time we met, this is what the party did. I actually have 3 different things. I have the recap, which is what I do at every session. I have the story notes, which is what I do at the end of every session. And the short fiction is when I feel particularly inspired and want to create a work of art from what we did, because it was so amazing. And so that's how I would do it if I was recommending something. Because, like you said, just recording 6 hours of audio and even video, sometimes it's like, wow, looking back on this, I enjoyed my time there, but this was 6 hours. It's too much. And that's also speaking actually to the difference between, say, a podcast, an actual play podcast like Critical Role, and just playing the game. Because playing the game, you're in the moment, it's great. Even if you say something that doesn't make sense, it's like everybody's having a good time. Whereas Critical Role, it's not scripted, but you are acting it out in a way as if it could be scripted. And I think that's like a big difference there.
Yeah, well, and the other function of the short fiction thing, there's two primary reasons why I do this for each Geras section that we play. The first is clear gameplay leverage, right? The reason I'm doing this and kind of retelling the events that happen are so that my players are informed of how to approach the narrative and the gameplay the next time they go, right? Because let's say that you misremember how a scenario went down, and that informs your decision making. I remember in campaign 1 with Gray Owls, there was this huge my character held a judgment on another character because of the information he was told, which then ended up being faulty information, like we later found out. Like, it just ended up being wrong, and it was communicated to me wrong. So that invalidated a lot of the acting that I did because I wasn't told the right thing, you know? And so what it does do is the secondary thing is that it invests trust between me as the DM and my players. Because, and you guys have both seen this before, where when I write out this fiction summary, I'm doing it in a Google Doc that all my players have access to at all times. And if there's an inconsistency, or if there's like something they wanted to rework, like I really wanted to come off more with this tone or with this intention, they're always free to comment on it. And I also make sure to ask permission. That's the biggest thing, is like, this is how I'm presenting your character. Is this what your intention was? And there's been plenty of times where I've thought that a player was going for one thing and it turns out they weren't. And so even in the session, like if something went awry, afterwards we can kind of come to an understanding. And the biggest thing, and I think that this is why, for the most part, and you guys, again, can feel to correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like we have a very trusting dynamic with those sessions. Part of it is because if a player had a different intention, I am willing to change from my DM presentation what happened to let the player tell the story they wanted to tell. Biggest example I have of this is I think we talked about it in a previous podcast, but I had presented this this crime boss, right? And really the personality I wanted was, she is somebody who's more made hard decisions that she thought were necessary, and that's why she's so violent or whatever. But if you actually look at what she's done, she's helped her community, she's like tried to keep drugs off the street, like even though she's like her methods are illegal, there's been a net positive because of her actions, right? Although that may not be interpreted by some of the characters. And one of the players was really like, the way they reacted was, crime boss bad. I can't trust her because she's crime bad. And it spoke to, part of it was I did not set up the scene effectively. Like looking back on my notes, there were certain things I was missing, mostly because I was looking for player interaction. But basically after having a conversation with the player after the fact, it was like, oh, well, they had also interpreted this signal from me. So how do I present it so that rather than make this player seem like they were making decisions out of the blue, what are now additional things I can add, or what are ways that I can change how the information was presented so it makes the player's character look good in the outcome, you know? And when you invest that kind of energy where it's not about me and my story, it's about how do I make my players, you know, how do I make my players basically come off in a good light? And I'm willing to change to help them tell the stories they want to tell. That's where the really cool stuff happens. But again, that's contributing to a narrative, not expressing your individual, you know? And I think that's where a lot of this comes from. Like I would argue opposite, Adam. I would say our group actually does do a lot of acting. We just write out our acting. We don't voice it, you know? So like we get really, well, yeah, but I mean, like you were saying, like we do 100% writing versus like voicing. And I do think that there's a certain acting mentality in how you write a character and express the character. We just have a different chosen medium, you know? So I would
Okay.
actually say, if you look back to the session, we had about 70% acting, 30% narrative. Like, most of our writing was in dialogue with each other to develop each other's characters, not about the main thread of, we need to go to this place to do this thing. Do you know what I mean?
So when we talk about narrative, are we talking then about DM descriptions and explorative descriptions? When we talk about acting, are we talking about interactions with each other?
From what the definitions of the DMG that I just read were, I feel like, based on those descriptions, acting is more about the characters, narrative is more about the character's relationship to the main plot, and the main plot being what the DM does. So, for example, the session 0.5 you were talking about was 100% acting because there was no narrative, right? So they were contributing to their character's development, right? Whereas storytelling players are contributing to the narrative. It's like, my character does this, which pushes the plot along. And with Legacy, there was plenty of times we would spend an hour just talking to each other, like, hey, how's it going? Haven't seen you in a while. Well, this is what I've been up to. What have you been up to? And even though we're not speaking out loud through a mic, there's still, it's that sense of acting in that we're spending time developing our characters' personalities first and their outlooks first. And really, if I looking back on it, I think that 30% of the total text that was written was about dedicated to, well, what's going on with Rowan? Oh, this stuff is going on with Rowan. This is the plot that's moving forward. But 70% of it was just like, oh, you're afraid. Is everything okay? This is me as a character checking in with your character. But that has nothing to do with the overall plot. That just has to do with kind of deepening personalities. Does that make sense?
It does, and then I still think that in terms of terminology of these two groups, they are supremely different in how they manifest at our table, and it's curious because I always feel weird putting a term on it. Like when we start getting into acting and versus narrative, it's like, but both tables have both. And I think we established it a little bit in the chat that the medium that's energizing is different. I think that the medium that is expressed through Team Legacy is, as you said, it's written. It's using the chat as the storytelling medium. But then when we break apart the pieces of that story, there's a lot of interpersonal speaking and interpersonal connections. You're doing a bunch of interactions. So for those of you listening, if you use the chat function, it doesn't mean you're not actors. And if you don't want to use the chat, it doesn't mean you're not narratives. There's a medium there. And I have difficulty categorizing because I never feel like I have the full picture. And I always feel like I'm missing something, so I'm going to misrepresent something.
Well, and the useful thing with categorizing is first making sure we're talking about the same thing, right? Because if we're talking about two different things, there's not really a use in the conversation, right? Because we're not on the same page. But the other thing we can do when we categorize it is now we can use it. You know, we can see where it's at relative to other things. And I think the primary use of identifying the mindset, which is really what we're talking about in terms of acting versus storytelling, it's more of a mindset thing, what perspective we're choosing to take. I think that is distinct from your chosen medium, but that doesn't mean that the medium also doesn't have value in talking about, because the medium is going to encourage certain details, right? So, for example, last night we played with a player, and having played a few different games with this player with different styles and different story structures, he tends to wait for everyone to stop talking to like engage, right? As long as we're talking, right? So when it was an auditory thing, he wouldn't speak up because he didn't want to step on the toes of anybody else. As soon as there was a typing function, I got more RP. I've seen more RP from that player than I have in years of playing with them. And it was because they felt comfortable with this medium that they weren't interrupting anybody, you know? And really, it wasn't about any of us personally. It was all about, again, contributing, last night's game anyway, contributing to the best narrative. Like, 3 of us would all, like, type in the same thing at the same time. Like, all of us approach the plot hook. And then we would sit back, and it's like, well, it wouldn't make sense that all 3 of us at the same time seeing each other would just bombard this one person. Like, do you need help? Like, it wouldn't have made sense for what we wanted to do and the style of game that we as players decided we wanted to play in the moment. So instead, it was what that medium allowed us to do was divorce the person who came up with the idea from the idea, and we could now choose what's the best idea. You know, what would be the best thing to make sense, or how can we change our ideas a little bit so that everyone can get a little bit of their idea in the final product. One of the things I've noticed with the talking thing is that what it does is it puts somebody on the spotlight and it gives someone their moment to shine. And that can be a very empowering thing, especially for if that person in other aspects of their life don't feel that they have that moment to shine as much. Not that there's a judgment on that or that's what's happening. I'm just saying that it's an effect of the, like right now, it's my moment to shine. Everybody else is quiet, you know? That's part of the medium we've chosen with podcasting virtually like this, you know? 2 people can't talk at the same time because then you don't hear anything, you know? And I think that that having that moment to shine and being empowered to practice speaking up, that is inherent to the medium, but not necessarily the mindset. Although I do believe that the medium will also impact the mindset. So I think that like there was still 70% acting, but I think that if we're in like a speaking thing, we're more likely to act than we are if we're able to type. You know what I mean? So the medium will affect the mindset, but they aren't like, and they're related to each other, but they aren't like the same thing, you know?
And that about does it. Thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in to today's episode of the DM Shower Thoughts. This podcast uploads every Friday at noon on iTunes and Spotify and Podbean, but iTunes and Spotify. And if you would like episodes early, as well as DM coaching and other cool custom content, you can check out our Patreon over at patreon.com/DM Shower Thoughts. And for more on everything else we do, including YouTube, please go to dmshowerthoughts.com. Have a wonderful day, everybody, and please, game responsibly. Bye-bye now.
I think the core of Dungeons & Dragons is puzzle and encounter design. I'll draw from favorite movies, video games, books, anything to create a one-of-a-kind play experience. When you start with a solid framework, all you need is to grab your best friends and hilarity ensues naturally. I'm Sully, Dungeon Master and host of the podcast How Friends Roll, a 5th edition actual play podcast of micro-campaigns featuring a rotating cast of characters. Come join our table. How Friends Roll is available wherever you get your podcasts.